We use the word composition to describe taking a photograph and some of the basic visual elements of taking a photograph because it's very much like writing a paper. We're composing something. The only difference is we have to use what we see. So not everything about a photograph comes out of our mind. Rather, it's our mind working with what's around us. This concept of composition, it can also be compared to a story. There are three basic concerns with composition: determining what your subject is, applying something we'll talk about called the rule of thirds, and getting the eye to look at the subject. How do we lead the people viewing our photographs to the subject? Let me ask you about this photograph. What's the subject? How do we know that's the subject? Most people are going to say that group of people walking down this snowy street are the subject. And probably the reason why we're looking at them, well, those three lights at the top seem to aim toward those people. So do the light posts, and in fact the very road. This photograph is saying exactly what our subject is. And here's another one that's very similar. What's the subject here? And what is the context of this picture? We would say those two people on the park benches are the subject. But what's the context? It looks like they're in a nice, wonderful place during the fall, and perhaps they're having a conversation. Perhaps they're having a relationship of some kind and enjoying a little bit of talk with each other. Again, a photograph is like a story, and every story has a subject and it has a context. It has the main character, and it has whatever the main character is doing in his or her environment. You don't have all the details to a photograph, so you have to infer many things, but that's part of the joy of why we like photographs in the first place. As you're taking photographs, get into the habit of looking for a subject and a context in every one of those photos. Let's talk about the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a very good guideline. Now, it's only a guideline, but it's a real good one. Put the most important visual element of your image close to one of these 4 thirds, or hot spots. If you think of a photograph as being covered with a tic-tac-toe grid, where the lines meet, those are the areas we're referring to as hot spots. And typically, not always, but typically, these are the places where we're going to see our subject's eyes. We'll see the horizon of the landscape, or something like the curb of the road. These thirds give our brain a clue as to how to interpret and how to understand the photograph. It's really more of a principle than a rule, and you'll see many variations of it. Look for it the next time you're reading a magazine or a newspaper, or you're looking at a favorite movie. This allows the context of your image to take a more equal role, and it tells a more interesting story. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's an example I don't appreciate. It's not really bad. One thing that has going for it is a lot of lights and lines are moving exactly toward the subject. On the other hand, I don't really know very much about where he is. This is a really typical example of the use of the rule of thirds. This subject is very obviously on a beach, so we know who she is and we know exactly what she's doing. She's looking over a beautiful, cloudy beach. Here's an example I don't like at all. Not only is the subject directly in the middle of this image, but his environment tells me almost nothing. I'm curious about that computer. I wish we had moved this particular camera angle lower and to the right. Here's an example of using the rule of thirds in a vertical format. This is very common. Notice where her eyes are. Here are some more examples of successes and failures. Let's test to see if we know which are working and which are not. Well, that was too easy because all of the failures are really on the right-hand side and all the successes are on the left-hand side. It simply makes more sense for us to show not only what we are looking at as our subject, but a little bit more about our subject and what our subject is doing, what the environment is all about around them. Which is the best tool for getting your composition correct? For many people, using a digital camera, it's the LCD, or the liquid crystal display, which is on the back of most digital cameras. Well, why? Well, it's rather big, and it could be a lot easier on your eyes. So, if that's good, what then would be the advantage of cameras that also have viewfinders? Well, a viewfinder can save you battery time because it uses less energy if you have the option of turning off your LCD display. The LCD helps composition for many people, especially people who may have eyesight problems. And some viewfinders can also display the rule of thirds. So there may be an advantage to using one or the other, depending on your situation. Remember, if you're taking photographs of something that's moving, to use a principle we call lead. Give lead to moving objects. Lead is the space in front of a moving object that suggests what might be happening next. Even a still object that's facing in one particular direction is usually needing space on that particular side. If a person's face is aiming right, we would put more space in front of their nose to the right of them, because we want to see the direction that they're looking at in case something appears there, even if it only appears in our imagination. The exception of this kind of rule is actually very rare. Now, in this photograph, another one which I took in the nation of Albania, you can see that these kids have a very definite direction. There's a set of stairs over to the left. In fact, even notice the cement on the wall. It seems to be suggesting which direction these kids are going. I also would like you to understand the value of having a new perspective when you're taking your photographs. I really can't overestimate this. I'd like you to think four-dimensionally, as I've mentioned before, in terms of the X, Y, and Z axes, and the special fourth dimension, meaning the dimension of time, which should cause us to take low-angle shots and learn to do things like framing things in our foreground. This would be, of course, the dimension of depth, as is done in these particular photographs. Learn to look upwards on objects. Learn to get underneath them. Learn to tilt them, and even get on top of them. If you're a good photographer, you should be very, very aerobic. Photography is space exploration. Take advantage of the space that God gives you and discover this incredible myriad of ways that you have to avoid dull photography. In many cases, photography should make you exhausted. You could be climbing on things. You could be crawling down low. I hope you have good knees. Or fly above your subject. Avoid what is called rooting. Rooting is simply taking photos from the same height. Rooting is taking photos from the same height and the same angle every time. Use your imagination.